From soldier flies to beef industry strategy, we've got a protein-packed episode of Between the Rows. Thanks for tuning in this week. I'm Lisa Gunther, Canadian Cattleman Editor and your host for this edition. This week, Geraldine Witchers, reporter with the Manitoba Co-operator, brings us a story all the way from Denmark on black soldier flies.
Right now, we're also looking into that from 1 kilogram of eggs, you will get something around 5,000 kilos of larvae that you can sell as product. That's a completely insane explosion in growth.
James Beckering, chair of the Canadian Beef Advisors, talks industry strategy.
We're searching out a lot of solutions, especially we focus a lot, and a lot of the strategy is based on a lot of the climate change actions, but we still have been able to seek out some things that may help us and actually bringing that to government. And
Brenna Grant, Executive Director of CanFax, tells us about some of the beef industry's 2030 environmental goals.
I would say 3NOP has so much potential because it is potentially 1/3 of our goal. And one of the reasons that it is exciting is because there are no known negative animal health or food safety concerns. And it is one of the most researched products out there with over 10 years of studies.
But first, a word from our sponsors.
No matter where you're at in your agricultural career, succession has probably crossed your mind. Whether you have that "I want the next generation to thrive" idea or "I want to get a head start" idea, RBC can help tailor a succession plan for you. Ensure that ownership of your operation, as well as your skills and knowledge, are easily passed on. Visit rbc.com/succession to learn more.
What the heck are the Canadian Beef Advisors, and what exactly is this group up to? Here to tell us more is James Beckering, chair of the National Cattle Feeders Association and the Canadian Beef Advisors. Thanks for joining me, James. So just to start off, just tell us, for those who don't know, who are the Canadian Beef Advisors and what do they do?
So the Canadian Beef Advisors are made up of the 7 national beef organizations that range from seed stock producer all the way up to the packaging sector and the marketing side. So we're representative of the entire chain of the beef industry.
And so it's been a challenging couple of years, I think, for everybody. What are some of the big challenges that you've faced when trying to get this strategy in place in the first 2 years?
Yeah, some of the big challenges have been fairly obvious. We started in 2020 with shutdowns in the meatpacking sector with COVID. Then that went on to drought situations, which led to feed shortages. And then we had some front of pack labeling issues that we were dealing with as well. So that all took a lot of energy out of the sector of all our organizations. I think the biggest thing that we see out of that is we were able to come together very well on those issues as that group, and we came together a lot on these issues, and we were able to work through those issues as an industry together. And I think what I'm proud of this group is we didn't let it slow us down on some of the strategy items. We did keep focus on some of the things that we're looking at in the beef strategy and trying to maintain that as well. So it was a lot of work for a lot of people through the last couple of years, but definitely we didn't lose focus on the strategy, but we did have a lot of those things that was taking energy away from a lot of people.
Yeah, so given that, what are you most proud of the industry having accomplished?
One of the real big things that was good for the industry is getting BSE negligible risk status with the OIE. That took a lot of effort on industry and government together to get that to where we are. But I also think even for an industry, we're searching out a lot of solutions. Especially we focus a lot, and a lot of the strategy is based on a lot of the climate change actions, but we still have been able to seek out some things that may help us, and actually bringing that to government as well. So we're trying to bring strategies to them as well, to getting them. We're trying to work with them to help us achieve our goals instead of the goals being pushed on us.
Yeah. So, kind of with some of those successes under your belt, given all that, what are your key priorities coming up in the next year or so?
Key priorities coming up in the next year, I think just staying the course and making sure that we can continue focusing on improvements, steady improvements.
Where do you see the biggest opportunity for the industry as a whole?
I think we have a big opportunity, and especially we've seen this, and maybe COVID is one of those things that brought this forward, is people will always need food, and we have a growing population, and the food source, the land base is not getting bigger, so we have to be more productive with what we have. And that's one thing we've done in the beef industry over not even the last 5 years or 10 years, the last 30, 40 years, is we've gotten a lot more efficient. And I think we're in a position that we can be that solution to making sure that this nationally to have a secure food source.
What do you see needing to happen for us to get there, like to leverage those opportunities you see with food production and becoming more efficient? What do we need?
I think one of the things that, as cattle feeders, we do look at how do we, in the long run, we do need some extra processing capacity. That sometimes can be a challenge for us as the feeding industry, and having that steady supply, I guess, and steady place to market our cattle to. So that's probably one of the big ones. And then also just working with government to make sure that we have the export markets available to us as well. We do have access to a lot of countries in the world, but there's always more opportunities. So
just kind of going back to the processing capacity, I know one of the things I think that's under this group is looking into the processing sector in Alberta. Do you want to comment on that? Yeah, I could. That essentially was an initiative by Alberta cattle feeders and Alberta beef producers to conduct essentially a study and a survey to see what are the barriers that current processing facilities have to growing, and then what are some unique opportunities for them as well. But also also build a set of recommendations to how we can increase that. Yeah, we're just trying to determine with people that are in the industry already what are their challenges and what barriers they have. Does government play a role in helping to reduce those barriers, or is the government a barrier to some of that? You got a big task in front of you, I think, with this group, but anything else you want to add that you think producers should know about? The one thing I will add is we are, as an industry in Canada, have been very proactive, and this strategy is showing that. When we look at other jurisdictions around the world and we start talking about a lot of this stuff, and especially sustainability is one of those big buzzwords around the industry and around the world, we should be proud of, as a industry, that we have been at the forefront of this. And I think we maybe don't tell that story enough, that as Canadian beef producers, we have been at the forefront of some of these issues. Great. Well, thank you very much, James. Really good talking to you today. Thanks, Lisa. That was James Beckering with the Canadian Beef Advisors. The Canadian Beef Advisors have also set 10-year goals in several areas, including animal health and welfare, people health and safety, beef quality and food safety, and technology. The advisors are also setting environmental and land use goals. Brenna Grant, Executive Director of CanFax, fills us in on the advisors' carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas targets. So today we're going to focus on the carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas goals. So what are the goals and where are we at right now with them?
So back in 2020, the Canadian Beef Advisors launched a whole suite of 2030 goals. And around greenhouse gas and carbon sequestration, we set out to safeguard the existing 1.5 billion tons of carbon stored on lands managed with beef cattle, to sequester an additional 3.4 million tons of carbon every year, and to reduce primary production greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 33% by 2030. And one of the things that we did when we started out was to do scenarios to see what would happen if we stayed on historical trend in terms of incremental improvement for greenhouse gas reductions. And that would essentially result in a 17% reduction. And this really does require ongoing research by the Beef Cattle Research Council and things that we already know. But we also need a major breakthrough in adoption levels or technology to reach our goal of 33% reduction. And so we're looking at things like estimating what would happen if 3-NOP, which is also known as Bovaer, were approved in Canada, and there was 100% adoption at backgrounding and finishing feedlots. And we know that is an unrealistic assumption, but what if? And really that would reduce emissions by 8 to 11% by itself. So that's almost a third of our goal. It still leaves us a gap that needs to be addressed by other technologies that are out there in terms of increasing adoption, maybe using existing production enhancing technologies, or using adoption levels of 3-NOP and total mixed rations for cows that are already using total mixed rations in the winter. But it really does show that this is going to be a very ambitious goal. On the carbon side, really right now the focus has been on making sure that we have research projects in almost every province from coast to coast in order to build knowledge, understanding that these sequestration rates are going to vary with different soil types, vegetation type, and grazing management.
So you mentioned 3-NOP, which is obviously a big one. But are there other practices that we know of right now that can either sequester more carbon or cut those emissions?
Absolutely. Dr. Kim Wilminski at the University of Manitoba did recent work looking at things like inclusion of legumes, extending the grazing season to reduce feeding days, keeping cattle on pasture versus confined in the winter, and precision feeding. And so that's not just ration balancing and ration changes, but also food upcycling. And using maybe different things within rations than we typically think of, as well as adoption of existing production enhancing technologies.
What needs to happen at the government and industry levels to meet these goals? I don't know if you want to pick a specific example like 3-NOP, but just what do we need to happen so we can actually get there?
I would say 3-NOP has so much potential because it is potentially 1/3 of our goal. And one of the reasons it is exciting is because there are no known negative animal health or food safety concerns. And it is one of the most researched products out there with over 10 years of studies. But it does need regulatory approval. And that's something that I know the policy groups are actively working on in order to address it. In terms of industry on that side of things, I think there are things that producers need to be aware of when thinking about some of these new products. And they need to be asking probably 3 questions. First, does the product have a performance benefit? And that's their consideration in terms of the cost benefit. Does it work for my operation? But the second is, are they stackable benefits with existing products being used? Do they have a similar mode of action or a different one? And this is really then going to consider what all they have on their operation and are currently using. But then third is, how is that greenhouse gas reduction going to be recognized? There's lots of talk internationally about this recognition piece being done very differently by different companies. And so being aware of how it's going to be recognized, and that you don't necessarily have to go out and get a carbon credit, because the Canadian Roundtable of Sustainable Beef's National Beef Sustainability Assessment will capture what everybody in the industry is doing and the adoption rates of all of these different products.
So there's a lot going on here, and you've talked about some of the implications for producers from Canadian, the Canadian Roundtable to Sustainable Beef, kind of what questions they should be thinking of. But what else does all this mean for producers?
I think some of this is down the road. In terms of something like 3-NOP, it's not even here yet. It's not even approved. And so for a lot of producers, it's just listening. But for others, one of the things that we're trying to ensure people are considering is, are there some of these existing practices that we know reduce emissions or increase carbon sequestration? And I mentioned these earlier, but I'll repeat them, of inclusion of legumes, extending the grazing season to reduce feeding days, keeping cattle on pasture versus confined in the winter, precision feeding, and adoption of existing production enhancing technology. And we really are asking producers of, are you using these on your operation already? And if so, can you actually expand it so that you're doing that on either more acres or more cattle? And if you're not doing these things, would you be willing to consider it? Would you be willing to go back and look at it, of how things changed on your operation? And if you have any questions about the practices, you can visit beefresearch.ca, where they have a lot of information.
So cattle do tend to get like a bad environmental rap these days, but I think we know the story is more nuanced, and there are environmental benefits as well to raising cattle. Will these, is part of this strategy to kind of counteract some of that public perception, or?
Yeah, we're really wanting to communicate that beef is part of the solution. And the fact that we are not blind to this conversation that's happening nationally and globally, that we're aware, that we're active in doing things around this, but really wanting to ensure that our own government is recognizing all of the good work that producers are already doing, and have done, in terms of the fact that the Canadian beef industry has one of the lowest greenhouse gas emissions intensity in the world already. And that we've already done so many things in terms of leading the world on this conversation to show that we are good stewards of the land, and that we need that land to stay in grasslands in order to keep that carbon sequestered that's being stored there.
So how else are these goals going to be used?
Yeah, so these are actually have been already incorporated into a number of the national organizations' 3 and 5 year plans. So they're incorporated into the Beef Cattle Research Council's research and extension strategy going out 2023 to 28. They're incorporated in the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef's sustainability strategy for the next 5 years. And it's really about recognizing that we need all of the national organizations to work together in terms of the policy for product approvals, the research, so that we actually have the science around carbon sequestration, the Canadian Roundtable of Sustainable Beef in terms of making sure that we're getting recognized for that sustainable story that we have in Canada. And so it's really about everyone working together towards the same thing.
So we're still learning a lot, I think, about soil carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, everything else. Is there anything that you've seen so far in the research that you found particularly interesting or hopeful or surprising? Or
at this point, the fact that we only have like a 6 to 8% gap on our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal in terms of a plan is, in my opinion, extremely exciting. We had set these as stretch goals for the industry to reach for something that we would not dare to do or imagine if we didn't set these goals. And that means that as industry, if we fall short on some of these goals, we still need to recognize that it was a really big stretch and that there was a lot of work that went behind to achieve these really big goals. And I think that's one of actually seeing what happens when you set something that is almost so big it's scary, to go, okay, it's really big, it's really scary, but we're just going to keep putting one foot in front of another, and we're going to see how far we get towards it. And realizing that 2 years in, we're only 7 calf crops away from 2030, but it means that we're a lot closer now than I thought we were going to be 2 years ago. And so don't be scared to set those big goals, because we can do great things together.
That is really great news. Thanks a lot, Brenna.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
That was CanFax's Brenna Grant on the Canadian Beef Advisor's carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas goals. For more information, visit beefstrategy.com. Thanks for joining us on Between the Rows. I'm Lisa Gunther, your host this week and editor of Canadian Cattleman. You've heard of cricket flour and mealworm patties, but for many, the ick factor is too high. Geraldine Witchers of the Manitoba Co-operator brings us a story on perhaps a more palatable use for insects.
What breeds faster than rabbits, can be pressed for oil like coconuts, and makes a high-protein feed for fish and livestock? I'm Geraldine Witchers, reporter with the Manitoba Co-operator. This summer, I traveled to Denmark's Jutland Peninsula to visit Enorm. Enorm is 1 part factory, 1 part farm. And what they farm are insects. Black soldier flies, to be precise. Lars Henrik Lau Heckman works with Skov, a Danish ventilation firm that has an entire department dedicated to insect farms. He spoke with a group of international journalists at the Enorm site about how insect feed products are taking off in Europe.
And we have actually, as you probably know, if you think about it, been working with insects in a farming context for thousands of years. I mean, beehives, for instance, is a good example there. And also in many places around the world, they use the natural population of flies that come and lay eggs, maybe in chicken manure, and then they take the larvae and they feed to the chicken. So it's not something that has not happened. Now we're just talking about large-scale controlled production, which is a lot like what we know from poultry and pigs. So it's a very new sector. I would say officially it's probably around 10 years old, the insect sector, at least in a European and an international context. And within those 10 years, there's been a lot of research and development ongoing initially. We'll still have a lot of that in the future, but we are now at the threshold where we are going into the commercial era. And as many other sectors, the insect sector has some challenges, many challenges, but I've tried to highlight the 3 main challenges here. It's upscaling the production to meet the needs of the market. It's regulatory. There are many legal barriers out there that provide, some hurdles for the sector to expand. And then consumer acceptance as the third main challenge. If we zoom in, then I would say consumer acceptance, that's mainly an issue when we're talking about eating the insects directly, because then we're talking about food culture, and then people are most happy with other people eating it normally. But there is actually a lot of recipes out there with eating insects, and more than 2,000 insects are known to be eaten throughout our history. but it becomes a very delicate topic when we talk about eating the insects ourselves. So if we feed them to fish and our pets or poultry, no problem. Then we feel even a little bit better because then at least they had it good as well. Regulatory, I would say we have moved over the last at least 5 years quite dramatically, but we are at a stage now where it's actually possible to commercially move ahead without too many obstacles. So I would say if we zoom in, the top challenge, it's upscaling. It's creating a volume of product that is relevant for the customers that are willing to take it on into products for pet food or feed or what have you. So you could say without having the scale, without having the tonnage, the other challenges are irrelevant. But of course, particularly for regulatory, we need also to be able to go to market, and that's not a problem at the moment. But in general, there's a lot of circular economy connected with insect farming. But then again, you could say farming has, since the beginning, always been about using your resources to the best extent. Insects just take it and try and make it a strong part of their narrative, that the circular farming, green economy, that's things you connect with insect farming. But it's often using waste streams, byproducts that are not right now used to the same extent for various reasons in, for instance, poultry and pig feed. So trying to use byproducts from dairy production, from beer production, from food production, and then mixing that into some feeds, some substrates that give also relevant production with the insects.
So, what does an insect farm look like?
When we zoom in on insect farming, overall, when you're driving out there and you're approaching Enorm or other insect farms, they will look very much like other big-scale farming. It's only until you open the doors that you see that there's something different going on here. We leverage a lot of the philosophies from classic animal farming. There are reasons why a layout of a farm looks like it looks, because there are some logistical and practical elements that have been, how can I say, refined for decades, for centuries. But they are big, normally, these farms. We're talking easily 20,000 or more square meters of sites, and some sites even being maybe at least they have ambitions to be maybe 30 or 40 or 50,000 square meters. And this is just farming buildings. So it's really big production sites. The larvae are kept in crates, big containers where they are living very densely, whereas the flies, they can fly, and we cannot just put them into a container. So they need a cage. It's a very, very fast life cycle. So from the fly has emerged, as it's called out of the pupae. Then they mate within a few days. They lay the eggs, and until those eggs have developed into a fly again, it takes a little bit more than a month, depending on nutrition and temperature. Because the insects are cold-blooded animals, just like fish. They need temperature from outside to keep the motor running. That's also one of the advantages, because when they get the temperature, the humidity from outside, particularly here, the temperature, then what we give them of feed, it goes directly on the back, so to speak. So they have a very, very high feed, very, very low, actually, feed conversion rate. And when you then, apart from being very fast, right now we're also looking into that from 1 kilogram of eggs, you will get something around 5,000 kilos of larvae that you can sell as product. That's a completely insane explosion in growth.
Yep, you heard that right. He said a 5,000-fold increase in protein production in 1 month. Yikes. And that's not all. They also produce an oil similar in properties to palm oil.
They have some very interesting fatty acids in their body. For instance, lauric acid, which is an equivalent to palm oil. It's a lot of lauric acid in the insects, and lauric acid actually has a known feature as a immune boosting fat. So very interesting ingredient there from the insects.
It's a young, growing industry, but in a post-mad cow world, legislators are leery of feeding animals to animals. Bug farmers have had to clear regulatory hurdles to get to market, and they're likely to face more.
Then when we go to the market and the numbers there, as was a question just before, if we start with the regulatory, so the second challenge that I put just before, then over the last 5 years, there has been an immense development. This is particularly in the EU. And there's been a lot of efforts going into getting insects allowed to be used, particularly in feed. Because of mad cow disease, as many of you are likely familiar with, there was a lot of strict legislation that was made in the late 90s, early 2000s, in Europe particularly. At that time, it was just said, okay, you can't feed, said a little black and white, terrestrial animals to terrestrial animals. But nobody thought of insects back then. Certainly then comes a very relevant protein source, fat source, but particularly here the protein is the trouble. And it's banned. Cannot do anything with it other than sell it to exotic pets, pet food. And there was a lot of work that needed to be done to lift the ban that insect protein could be used for fish, for poultry, for pigs. And that has... That started to unfold from about 2017, when it was made allowed to use insects for aquaculture. And then I believe it was last year or late 2020, poultry and pigs also were allowed that they could have insects. So if we focus on Europe, that presently over 1,000 people are employed in this sector, which is a very good start considering it's a small size still. And that within 2030, it will be 25 times more people employed. There's already been some decent investments in this area, over 1 billion euros. But this is also expected to expand quite dramatically over the coming few years, actually.
It's not just the Danes getting in on the soldier fly action. Canada's Food Inspection Agency has approved insect products for pets, aquaculture, pig farming, and poultry. Enterra, with sites in Alberta and British Columbia, produces soldier fly larvae for feed and sells fly waste, called frass, as fertilizer. This spring, the federal government pledged $6 million to help Entosystem Inc. build a new soldier fly growing facility outside of Drummondville, Quebec. According to an American research firm, Canada's black soldier fly market will be worth $18.4 million by 2028. That's a lot of bugs.
That was Geraldine Witchers of the Manitoba Co-operator. Well, folks, that's a wrap on this week's edition of Between the Rows. Many thanks to our guests this week, as well as to Geraldine Witchers and our producer, Bruce Thorson. All the best with harvest and the fall calf run, and enjoy the last days of summer.
No matter where you're at in your agricultural career, succession has probably crossed your mind. Whether you have that "I want the next generation to thrive" idea or "I want to get a head start" idea, RBC can help tailor a succession plan for you. Ensure that ownership of your operation, as well as your skills and knowledge, are easily passed on. Visit rbc.com/succession to learn more.